The ghosts of the Silent Throne Empire did not haunt the galaxy with specters or whispers, but with laws. The most feared of these was a single, dormant piece of legislation buried deep within the Council's foundational charters, a relic of an age of terror. It was called the Directive of Strategic Preemption, forged in the ashes of a trillion-sun dominion that had nearly extinguished sentient life through sheer, terrifying intellect. The Silent Throne had not conquered with overwhelming fleets or planet-shattering weapons, but with thought. They could see the flow of causality, predicting market collapses, political scandals, and stellar flare-induced famines years in advance. They played the galaxy like a game of Dejaric, always 3, 4, sometimes 5 moves ahead, until their opponents found themselves not merely checkmated, but dismantled, their societies unraveled from within without a single shot fired in anger. Their fall was as enigmatic as their rise, an implosion of incomprehensible complexity, leaving behind a power vacuum and a singular galactic-wide trauma. The nascent council, formed from the survivors, codified their fear into law. The directive was simple and absolute. Any species that demonstrated a consistent, predictive capability 3 strategic moves beyond established council security doctrine was to be designated a Xylos-level threat. The designation had only one prescribed outcome. There was no trial, no appeal. The threat was to be excised from the cosmic equation, swiftly and irrevocably. For 2,000 years, the law had never been invoked. It was a historical curiosity, a testament to a bygone nightmare, until humanity joined the galactic stage. The invitation for a cultural exchange was extended with the best of intentions, a gesture of goodwill toward the talkative, chaotic, and surprisingly resilient new species from the Sol system. Humanity, barely a century out from its own cradle, was a curiosity. They were physiologically unimpressive, politically fractured, and their technology was a patchwork of elegant innovation and bafflingly primitive stopgaps. Yet they had endured. Their archival data, a messy, cacophonous flood of information, spoke of a history steeped in constant, unrelenting conflict, not just with their environment but with themselves. This, to the long-lived and largely stable species of the Council, was their most perplexing quality. High Counselor Valerius of the Cygnian Ascendancy, a being whose feathered form shimmered with the iridescence of age and wisdom, had been the primary advocate for the exchange. "They are children," he had chirped in the Grand Conclave, his voice a series of melodic, resonant notes. "Brash, loud children, yes, but full of a unique vitality. Their art is drenched in pathos. Their science leaps forward in chaotic, brilliant bursts. To fear them is to fear the unpredictable nature of life itself. We must engage them, guide them, and welcome their perspective." His primary opponent was Grand Marshal Cathar of the Heckmer Imperium, a hulking insectoid whose chitinous plates bore the scars of 1,000 ritual combats. His voice was a low, guttural rasp, each word ground out like stone on stone. "Vitality, I have reviewed their history, Counselor. It is a litany of self-mutilation. They turn their brilliant bursts of science into weapons to use against their own kind. They do not learn from their history, they rhyme with it, each new verse more destructive than the last. They are not children. They are a virus, contained for now to a single system. To invite them here is to invite plague into the heart of the Council." But Valerius's faction, the faction of optimism and diplomacy, had won the day. The exchange would proceed. As a show of martial camaraderie, it would include a series of simulated war games, pitting a pair of humanity's best officers against the Council's most celebrated tactician. It was meant to be a teaching exercise, a demonstration of the sophisticated, humane doctrines of modern galactic warfare. It was meant to be a gentle introduction, not a final exam. Commander Eva Rostova and Lieutenant Commander Jackson Jax, Miller of the Alliance Navy, stepped onto the teleportation plinth on Io and rematerialized moments later in the heart of the Citadel, the Council's orbital capital. The sheer scale of the place was a physical blow. The air, a precisely engineered cocktail of gases, tasted of ozone and alien flora. The vaulted ceiling soared into an artificial sky where miniature nebulae swirled in graceful ballets of light. Beings of 100 different biologies glided, scuttled, and strode through the grand promenade, a living tapestry of the galactic community. Try not to look like we just fell off the turnip truck, Jax, Rostova murmured, her voice calm and even, betraying none of the awe that was constricting her own lungs. She was a compact woman with pale eyes that seemed to miss nothing, her dark hair pulled back in a severe regulation bun. Her mind was a place of quiet, orderly lines and probabilities. Jax, broader and with a more expressive face, let out a low whistle. "Turnip truck, Eva, we just stepped out of a phone booth into God's waiting room. A little gaping is probably expected." He grinned, a flash of white teeth that seemed jarringly predatory in this serene environment. His role was the foil to Rostova's cold calculation. The improviser, the people person, the man who could translate her esoteric strategies into the visceral language of a firefight. They were met by a Kelnari, a being resembling a column of iridescent, shifting liquid housed within a transparent environmental suit. Tentacles of pearlescent light pulsed within its form. This was Emissary P. Lore. "Commander Rostova, Lieutenant Commander Miller, on behalf of the Council, I bid you welcome. We trust your transition was non-disruptive." The voice was synthesized, a pleasant baritone. "It was fine," Rostova said, her tone professional. "We are honored by the Council's invitation." "Excellent. Your opponent in the Stella Cuna Crucible, Fleet Lord Jean, eagerly awaits the opportunity to exchange tactical philosophies. He is a celebrated artist in the medium of strategic simulation." There was a subtle pulse in P. Lore's liquid form that might have been amusement. The humans were the rustic amateurs, Jean the Grandmaster. The outcome was a foregone conclusion. As they were escorted to their quarters, passing under arches of living crystal and past gardens of floating, phosphorescent fungi, Jax leaned closer to Rostova. "You get the feeling we're the Washington Generals in this little show." Rostova's gaze was distant, already cataloging architectural stress points and traffic flow choke points. "The Harlem Globetrotters always play to the crowd, Jax," she replied softly. "They're performers. Let's make sure we know exactly what kind of performance they're expecting." She wasn't here for a cultural exchange. She was here to do a job. The nature of that job, she was beginning to suspect, was far different from what either she or her hosts imagined. The Stella Cuna Crucible was not a mere simulator. It was a universe in a bottle. Housed in a spherical chamber a kilometer in diameter, the central space was a void of perfect black, awaiting the holographic birth of star systems, fleets, and the intricate, invisible webs of logistics and communication that bound them together. Spectator galleries lined the equator of the sphere, filled with a diverse audience of diplomats, military observers, and media representatives from across the Council's member worlds. The air buzzed with polite, multi-species chatter. Fleet Lord Jean entered his command pulpit with the fluid grace of his cephalopod race. His personal environmental tank was a work of art, filigreed with silver and gold, his many manipulatory tendrils already dancing across the holographic controls. He was the Council's undefeated champion, a being whose mind could simultaneously process dozens of tactical variables. He regarded the two humans entering the opposing pulpit with an air of benign condescension. They sat at a simple, unadorned console. One of them, the male, was looking around the gallery with a wide-eyed grin. The female was staring into the black void, her expression unreadable. "For our first scenario," the Glimmerkin moderator's voice echoed through the chamber, a shimmering cascade of sound, "we will simulate a standard anti-piracy operation in the Viridian Shoals. A rogue element has seized a key asteroid mining facility. Fleet Lord Jean will command the Council Security Task Force. The human delegation will command the pirate forces. The objective is to demonstrate the principles of measured response and de-escalation." A star map bloomed in the void. A small system, a gas giant with a retinue of rocky moons, one of which blinked red, indicating the captured facility. A sleek, powerful Council fleet materialized on one side of the system map. On the other, a motley collection of converted freighters and repurposed assault craft, the human-controlled pirates. Jean barely glanced at the disposition of the human fleet. It was a standard defensive posture, clustered around the captured moon. Predictable, amateurish. He initiated a classic pincer movement, sending two fast cruiser wings on wide, sweeping arcs to flank the pirates while his main battle group advanced slowly, broadcasting demands for surrender. It was elegant, efficient, and by the book. In the human pulpit, Jax shifted in his seat. He's splitting his forces, arrogant. He's demonstrating doctrine, Rostova corrected, her fingers flying across her console. He expects us to panic and try to punch through the middle or get caught in his crossfire. He sees our fleet as the objective. She brought up a schematic of the captured mining facility. But the objective isn't the fleet, it's the asteroid. What's its chief export? Jax scanned the data. Duranium ore, high yield, key component for hyperdrive cores. There's one refinery and system that processes it on that moonlet over there, Rostova said, highlighting a tiny, seemingly insignificant celestial body. It's where Jean's reserve fuel tankers are loitering. He thinks they're safe. You're not going to? Jax started, a slow smile spreading across his face. He thinks we're pirates. Let's act like it. Rostova retasked their most powerful ship, a heavy cruiser they'd been holding in reserve. It wasn't a warship in the simulation's code, but a modified or hauler. To Jean's sensors, it would look like their command ship, their queen on the chessboard. She sent it on a desperate, suicidal run directly at Jean's main fleet. As Jean watched, his internal monologue was one of satisfaction. The humans were panicking just as he'd predicted. A foolish charge. He tightened his pincer, preparing to swat their flagship out of the sky, but it was a feint. As Jean's attention was fixed on the decoy, two of the smallest, fastest pirate frigates, ships he had dismissed as gnats, broke from the main group. They weren't heading for the battle. They were burning hard on a trajectory he hadn't even considered, slingshotting around the gas giant's gravity well toward the refinery moonlet. Before Jean's multitasking mind could fully process the anomaly, the frigates reached his undefended fuel tankers. They didn't fire a shot. In the simulation, they initiated a plasma vent. A massive cloud of ionized gas, harmless to warships, enveloped the tankers and the refinery. The simulation registered the result instantly. Catastrophic contamination. All duranium fuel production halted. Jean's entire fleet, designed for long-range efficiency, suddenly had a fuel crisis. His pincer movement stalled. His ships were stranded. Rostova's pirate fleet, still clustered around the mining facility, then methodically began to pick off his isolated cruisers one by one. The simulation ended a few minutes later with a decisive human victory. A stunned silence fell over the gallery. Jean floated in his tank, his tendrils frozen. He had not been beaten, he had been humiliated. The humans hadn't engaged his fleet. They had attacked his logistics, a move so audacious, so contrary to the exercise's premise of a direct naval engagement that he hadn't even considered it a possibility. It was move one. The second scenario was more complex, breaking a planetary blockade. Jean, chastened and furious, was now commanding the blockading force. He would not be caught off guard again. He established a multi-layered sensor net, deployed interdiction fields, and held his fleet in a tight, reactive formation. He expected misdirection. He was ready for it. This time, Rostova and Jax were commanding a relief flotilla. Their goal was to deliver humanitarian aid to the blockaded planet. He's turtled up, Jax noted, studying the holographic display. He's expecting a fast runner, a stealth ship, something to slip through the net. And we'll give him one, Rostova said. But her focus wasn't on the ships. It was on the data streams flowing within the simulation. The blockade is unpopular. The galactic media is portraying it as aggression. The blockaded planet has a powerful information warfare directorate. She started typing, not fleet commands, but code. She was injecting data into the simulation's communications channels. A single, small transport ship, broadcasting civilian relief codes, detached from the human flotilla and made a run for the planet. Jean's tactical mind immediately identified it as the primary threat. He diverted a significant portion of his fleet to intercept it, a hammer to crack a nut, to make a point. But as his ships closed in, their communication systems suddenly lit up with false orders, ghost signals, and most devastatingly, a perfectly faked message, seemingly from Council High Command, ordering a stand-down. It was layered with Jean's own command authentications, spliced from his earlier communications. Simultaneously, Rostova fed the simulation's galactic media, with footage of Jean's fleet moving to intercept a clearly marked aid vessel. The planet's own info-warfare specialists, cued by Rostova's injected code, amplified the signal. Within the simulation, public opinion on Jean's home world plummeted. Political pressure mounted. His crew's morale, a quantifiable metric in the crucible, began to nosedive. A simulated mutiny, fueled by the fake stand-down order and the perceived dishonor of their mission, paralyzed his command cruiser. While Jean's fleet was in chaos, wrestling with contradictory orders and internal dissent, the rest of the human flotilla, moving at a slow, deliberate pace, passed through a now porous section of his blockade and reached the planet. They hadn't outrun him or outgunned him. They had outthought him on a plane he barely knew existed. They had weaponized public opinion. The gallery was no longer silent. A low, uneasy murmur rippled through the assembled beings. This was not strategy as they understood it. This was something else. Unconventional, unsettling. It was move two. For the final scenario, the stakes were raised. It was a full-scale war simulation. Rostova and Jax would defend the Corellian expanse, a vital sector of 3 star systems, against an overwhelming invasion force commanded by Jean. The moderator announced that Jean would have a 3-to-1 advantage in ships, and his objective was the conquest of the sector's capital planet. This time, Jean was a being possessed. There was no arrogance left, only a cold, burning need for vindication. He would not be tricked. He would not be outmaneuvered. He would use pure, unstoppable force. He massed his entire fleet into a single, terrifying battle group and drove it like a spear aimed at the heart of the capital system. All his multi-threaded consciousness focused on a direct, brutal assault. Jax watched the crimson icons of Jean's armada converge on the display. No feints, no tricks, just a sledgehammer. He's learned his lesson. He's learned the wrong lesson, Rostova said softly. Her eyes were fixed on a different part of the map, 3 sectors away from the battle, in a region designated as neutral territory. A small, uninhabited nebula with a single communications relay. It was an insignificant node, barely worth a footnote in a standard strategic briefing. He thinks the battle is here, she said, tapping the capital system. He thinks the objective is that planet. It's not. The objective is never the objective, Jax. It's what the objective allows you to do. She began issuing a series of baffling commands. She pulled her main defense fleet away from the capital planet, leaving it almost naked before Jean's onslaught. She sent a handful of stealth corvettes not toward the enemy fleet, but on a long, looping journey into the neutral nebula. In his pulpit, Jean saw the human fleet pull back. A fatal error. They were ceding the field. Victory was his. His ships entered the capital system, his guns preparing to pound the planetary defenses into submission. The conquest was minutes away. The Glimmerkin commentators were describing the baffling human retreat, speculating on a system malfunction or a desperate, failed gambit. High Counselor Valerius watched from his private box, his feathers ruffled with anxiety. He had hoped for a good showing from the humans, not this collapse. Beside him, Grand Marshal Cathar made a low clicking sound, a Heckmer expression of vindicated certainty. Then it happened. As Jean's fleet prepared its final attack run, his command console went dead. Not just his console, but his entire fleet's command and control network. The holographic icons of his ships began blinking erratically, their formations breaking, their movements becoming random. The simulation declared. Council Force Command and Control Network severed, fleet cohesion lost, mission failure. A wave of utter confusion swept the chamber. What had happened? The display zoomed out, replaying the last few minutes from a wider perspective. It showed Rostova's stealth corvettes arriving at the insignificant communications relay in the neutral nebula. It wasn't just a relay. It was the master node for the entire sector's quantum entanglement communication network, the system through which Jean's instantaneous commands were routed. It was a piece of infrastructure so fundamental, so deeply embedded, that it was considered part of the simulation's unassailable background. It was the board, not a piece on the board. The humans hadn't attacked Jean's fleet. They hadn't defended the planet. They had identified the linchpin of his ability to wage war at all, a linchpin Jean himself didn't even know was in play, and they had surgically removed it. It was a decapitation strike on the nervous system of his army. It was Move 3. In the profound, tomb-like silence that followed, a single thought echoed in the mind of every observer who knew the old laws. They hadn't just predicted John's move. They had predicted his reaction to their first move, and then they had predicted his counter-reaction to their second move. They had seen the entire game from start to finish, before the first piece had been moved. High Counselor Valerius felt a cold dread crystallize in his core, a feeling his long-lived species had not experienced for millennia. He looked at the two humans in their pulpit. They weren't celebrating. The woman Rostova was looking directly at his private box, her pale eyes holding his gaze across the vast chamber. In her look there was no triumph. There was only the quiet, terrifying calm of complete understanding. She knew exactly what she had just done. And she knew what it meant. The shockwave did not travel at the speed of light, it was instantaneous. Within minutes of the final simulation's conclusion, the recording of the Stella Cuna Crucible event was the most viewed item on the Galactic ComNet. Glimmerkin news anchors, their forms flickering with agitated light, replayed the final, devastating move again and again. Kelnari philosophers posted long, winding treatises on the paradigm shift in strategic thought. Heckmer military channels simply showed the final result, followed by a long, ominous silence. Fleet Lord Jean was escorted from the crucible chamber in a state of professional shock, his liquid form a murky, turbulent gray. His public statement was brief, admitting only to being confronted by a novel and effective strategic philosophy. But the damage was done. The Council's greatest tactician had not just been defeated. He had been rendered obsolete, his entire school of thought dismantled publicly by two newcomers from a backwater world. Humiliation was a shallow word for the abyss that had opened at his feet. For Rostova and Jax, the change was immediate and palpable. The respectful deference of their council hosts evaporated, replaced by a cold, impenetrable politeness. They were escorted back to their quarters, luxurious, but now unmistakably a cage, by a squad of stony-faced Secforce guards. Their access to the wider ComNet was cut off. They were isolated. "Okay, so I'm thinking the cultural exchange part of the tour is officially over," Jax said, pacing the length of their spacious suite. He ran a hand through his hair. "What the hell just happened, Eva? I was following your lead, but even I didn't see that last move coming until you explained it. You didn't just beat him. You broke his brain." Sat perfectly still on a plush, alien-shaped couch, her hands folded in her lap. "I ran a standard threat assessment. The most effective way to neutralize a superior force is to disable its command infrastructure. In this case, the infrastructure was the quantum entanglement node. It was the most logical target." Jax stopped pacing. "Eva, nobody targets the physics of the simulation. That's like in a chess game deciding to win by setting the board on fire. They looked at us like we were monsters." "No," Rostova said, her voice quiet but firm. "Not monsters. They looked at us like we were human. We have millennia of practice at this, Jax. We've fought wars of attrition, wars of ideology, wars of economics, civil wars, world wars. We've fought foes who were our brothers. When you fight yourself for that long, you learn to look for every weakness, every vulnerability, every loophole, because your enemy has the exact same hardware and software you do. You have to find a different way to win. They've had 2,000 years of peace. Their concept of warfare is ritualized. Ours is existential." A chime sounded, and a tray of nutrient paste and sterilized water slid silently from a slot in the wall. "Their dinner," Jax stared at it. "They're scared of us." "Yes," Rostova replied, "and they should be, not because we're malicious but because we think differently, and their history has taught them to be terrified of a certain kind of thinking." She finally looked at him, her eyes dark with a gravity he had never seen before. "There's a law, Jax, an old one. I read about it in the briefing materials they sent us. Something about the Silent Throne Empire, something about predicting moves." The full weight of their situation began to settle on him. They hadn't won a game. They had triggered an ancient alarm, a tripwire buried in the foundations of galactic law. They were no longer guests. They were evidence. Deep in the Citadel's core, the emergency council chamber was sealed. The circular room was stark, carved from black, non-reflective obsidian that drank the light. Here, there were no observers, no aides, no ceremony. Only the primary counselors of the 12 founding species, High Counselor Valerius stood, his feathers drooping, his melodic voice strained. What we witnessed was not a war game. It was a revelation. The humans, with a fraction of our experience and resources, demonstrated a capacity for predictive strategy that has not been seen in this galaxy since the age of the Silent Throne. Marshal Cathar's heavy form shifted, his chitin scraping against the stone floor. I take no pleasure in this, Valerius, but I warned you. I warned all of you. The directive of strategic preemption is not a guideline, it is an imperative. It exists for this exact reason: to prevent a second coming. Invoking the directive is madness, countered a new voice, that of the Lyran delegate, a silicon-based life form whose crystalline body chimed softly as it resonated. On the basis of a simulation, we invited them here. To exterminate a species for being too clever is the act of a tyrant, not a council. Cathar slammed a heavy manipulator arm on the table before him, the sound cracking through the chamber. Tyranny is allowing a predator to grow strong in your midst until it is too late to stop it. Do you forget what the throne did? Have 2,000 years of peace made you so soft? He gestured, and a holographic archive file illuminated the center of the room. It was not a recording of battles. It was a causal chain. It showed the Silent Throne buying up futures in a specific protein crop on an agri-world. 2 years later, a blight, genetically engineered and released by their agents, wiped out the primary food source of the Heckmer homeworld, Cathar's ancestors. Starvation led to riots. The riots forced the Heckmer fleet, which was guarding a key strategic hyperlane, to return home to restore order. With the hyperlane undefended, the Silent Throne's true target, a technologically advanced and isolationist race, was suddenly vulnerable. They were absorbed into the Empire without a fight, their entire society collapsing from the sudden economic shock of the Heckmer trade route closing. That, Cathar rasped, his voice vibrating with ancestral memory and fury, was one move. The crop futures. The blight and the fleet recall were the predictable consequences. They dismantled our allies by manipulating our biology and our honor. They didn't need to fight us. They made us defeat ourselves. He turned his multifaceted eyes on Valerius. The humans did not attack Jean's fleet. They attacked his fuel supply. They attacked his chain of command. They attacked his morale. They do not see the pieces on the board. They see the board itself, and they are willing to break it to win. This is the same pattern of thought. The directive must be invoked. A faction began to form around Cathar, composed of species who had suffered most under the throne or whose cultures were built on rigid adherence to tradition and law. The fear in the room was a tangible thing. Valerius felt the debate slipping away from him. The appeal to fear was always more powerful than the appeal to hope. He looked at the faces around the table, the cautious, the pragmatic, the frightened. They were seeing the ghost of the Silent Throne wearing a human face. He had to offer them an alternative. And what if we are wrong? Valerius's voice cut through the rising tide of fear. The Silent Throne sought dominion. They were conquerors. Have the humans shown any such inclination? No, they answered our invitation. They participated in our games. They won, yes, decisively. But their history, as chaotic as it is, shows one other consistent trait. When faced with a truly existential external threat, they are capable of unprecedented unity. They fight among themselves, but they have, on occasion, stood together against the darkness. He leaned forward, his own multifaceted eyes pleading. This ability they have, this terrifying, brilliant strategic foresight, was forged in the crucible of their own self-inflicted chaos. What if it is not a weapon to be used against us, but a tool we desperately need? We have enemies beyond the galactic rim. The void swarms, the sentinels of the outer dark, threats our conventional, honorable methods of war have failed against time and again. We see a threat. I see a potential asset. A species that thinks unlike any other. To recruit them, to harness this ability, would be to gain the greatest strategic advantage this council has ever known. The room divided. The recruitment faction, led by Valerius and the Lyrans, argued for potential and partnership. The elimination faction, led by Cathar, argued for safety and the grim lessons of history. The debate raged, a vortex of political maneuvering, ancient fears, and the uncertain future of an entire species hanging in the balance. The council was deadlocked, trapped between a terrifying new possibility and the long shadow of its own past. Confined to their quarters, Rostova and Jax began to work. Their isolation was a form of sensory deprivation, but for Rostova it was clarifying. With no external data, she was forced to rely on pure deduction. "They're debating a law," she stated, not as a question, but as a fact. "The directive of strategic preemption. We met the criteria, 3 moves. The debate isn't about whether we qualify, it's about the disposition." "Disposition," Jax repeated, the word tasting like ash. "You mean whether they give us a medal or blow up our planet?" "Essentially. There will be 2 main factions. A security faction, arguing for elimination based on the precautionary principle, and a progressive faction arguing for integration or observation. The security faction will use fear and historical precedent, the silent throne. The progressive faction will argue for potential gain and the moral implications of xenocide." "Wins?" Jax asked, his voice tight. "In any stable, long-lived bureaucracy." "Fear usually wins," Rostova said, her voice devoid of emotion. "Fear is the safer bet. It requires no innovation, no risk. So we're screwed." It wasn't a question, not necessarily. Rostova stood up and began to pace, her movements as precise and deliberate as her thoughts. "They are analyzing a binary choice, recruit or eliminate, friend or foe, asset or threat. The problem is we don't fit neatly into either category. Our very nature is the dilemma. So we need to give them a third option. And what's that? We need to reframe the problem. They see our strategic thinking as a weapon pointed at them. We have to convince them to see it as a shield, one they can hold." She stopped and looked at the single, sealed comms panel in the room. "We can't talk to them, but they're certainly listening. Everything we say, everything we do in this room is being recorded and analyzed." A slow understanding dawned on Jax's face. "This room, it's another test. It's the 4th scenario," Rostova confirmed. "And it's the only one that matters." She walked to the center of the room, into the primary pickup range of whatever surveillance devices were hidden in the walls and ceiling. She looked up as if addressing the Council directly. "The Council's greatest strategic vulnerability isn't an external enemy," she began, her voice clear and carrying. "It's internal. It's the potential for another silent throne to rise from within its own ranks. A member species that develops this kind of predictive ability in secret and uses it to manipulate the Council for its own ends. The current system is built on trust. Trust is a vulnerability." Jax watched, mesmerized, as she laid out her argument to an unseen audience. "You fear our ability to deconstruct your strategies," she continued. "That is a valid fear, but you are aiming that fear in the wrong direction. You don't need to eliminate the ability. You need to institutionalize it. You need a permanent, independent body whose sole function is to think like your worst enemy. A red team directorate designed to constantly wargame against the Council itself, to find and expose vulnerabilities in your security, your economy, your political structure, before a true adversary can." Her voice gained strength, becoming not a plea but a proposal. "We can be that institution, not as members of the Council, subject to its politics and allegiances, but as an external, autonomous auditor, a permanent, loyal opposition. We will take our unique, threatening perspective, a perspective born of a history you find so terrifying, and we will turn it to your service. We will be the ones who tell you the things you don't want to hear. We will be your strategic immune system. This is the 4th move, not recruit or eliminate, create." She fell silent. The only sound in the room was the faint hum of the environmental systems. She had just laid their entire species on the table, offering not servitude, but a strange, dangerous, and indispensable form of partnership. It was an unprecedented gambit, an offer to become the galaxy's necessary evil. The feed from the human quarters was piped directly into the sealed Council chamber. Rostova's words echoed in the obsidian room, falling into a stunned silence. The councilors looked at one another, their expressions ranging from shock to dawning comprehension. Cathar was the first to speak, his guttural voice softer than before, laced with disbelief. "They offer to be their own jailers." "No," Valerius breathed, his feathers fluffing with a surge of adrenaline and hope. He saw the breathtaking elegance of the move. "Not jailers, auditors. Can't you see? It is the perfect solution." It acknowledges the danger they represent. It addresses our fears directly, and it harnesses their ability not for conquest but for preservation. It turns the very thing we fear into our greatest shield. Lyran delegate chimed in agreement. It is a logically flawless proposition. To refuse, it would be to admit that we fear our own weaknesses more than we desire our own security. Rostova's proposal had shattered the binary deadlock. It was not a plea for mercy, but a strategic masterstroke that addressed the core anxieties of every member present. It offered Cathar's faction the containment they craved, while offering Valerius's faction the partnership they hoped for. It was a political checkmate. The debate that followed was brief and decisive. The motion to invoke the directive of strategic preemption was withdrawn. In its place, a new resolution was drafted. The establishment of the Archimedes Directorate, an independent human-led institution, chartered and funded by the Council, with the sole mandate of adversarial strategic analysis. They would be the galaxy's watchmen, tasked with thinking the unthinkable to keep the Council safe from itself and from threats yet to come. The vote was nearly unanimous. Hours later, the doors to Rostova and Jax's quarters slid open. High Counselor Valerius stood in the doorway, flanked not by guards but by diplomats. His iridescent feathers were smooth, his posture regal once more. He inclined his head in a gesture of profound respect. Commander Rostova, Lieutenant Commander Miller. His melodic voice was imbued with a new tone, one of awe. The Council has considered your proposal. Your analysis of our strategic vulnerabilities was astute. It was a logical deduction based on the available data, Rostova replied, her composure unwavering. Valerius allowed a series of soft, musical chirps that was the Cygnian equivalent of a wry smile. Of course, logic, your species has a formidable understanding of the concept. He stepped aside. Your isolation is at an end. Your new role, your species' new role, awaits. It will not be an easy one. You will be feared. You will be distrusted. You will be watched. But you will be necessary. Jax looked from Valerius to Rostova, whose calm expression finally softened with the barest hint of relief. They hadn't just saved themselves. They had redefined humanity's place in the cosmos in the space of a single afternoon. They were no longer petitioners, seeking a seat at the table. They were the fulcrum on which the entire balance of galactic power now rested. As they stepped out of their quarters and back into the grand, alien promenade of the Citadel, they knew nothing would ever be the same. Humanity had not been recruited, and it had not been eliminated. It had become something new, something the galaxy had never conceived of. A tool sharp enough to be a weapon, a mind clear enough to be a shield. The Archimedes gambit had been played, and the future, for both humanity and the ancient galactic civilization that had so badly underestimated it, was now an open and vastly more interesting game.